Much of his time was spent in the North where, although legal, slavery was far less common than in his native Virginia. He saw firsthand an economic system that did not depend upon slavery. Perhaps more importantly, the ideals for which he was fighting directly opposed a system that viewed human beings as property. By the end of the war, he saw African American troops fighting side by side with whites in the struggle against the British. He had also heard the ideas of close friends, such as the Marquis de Lafayette and John Laurens, who opposed the institution of slavery. It is almost certain that George Washington saw the irony in this situation. By 1794, this attitude was clearly expressed in a letter written to a friend.
Were it not, then, that I am principled against selling Negroes as you do cattle in the market, I would not, in 12 months from this date, be possessed of one as a slave.
There was also a strong economic reason for Washington's changing attitude toward the use of slave labor. He was a very practical man, and both his calculation of the fiscal return on slaves and his experiences at Mount Vernon made him question the economic viability of the system. At Mount Vernon, Washington was responsible by law for feeding and clothing a community of more than 300 people, almost half of whom were either too old or too young to work. As a businessman, this may have affected his views on slavery. Whatever his reasoning, we know that his attitude toward slavery began to change, and in 1778 he instructed his farm manager at Mount Vernon to stop selling slaves, stating that he was opposed to breaking apart families. In 1786, he wrote to a friend that he would like to see a plan adopted by the legislature for the gradual abolition of slavery.
I never mean, unless some particular circumstance should compel me to it, to possess another slave by purchase, it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees.
On August 18, 1799, in a letter to his nephew, Robert Lewis, Washington wrote,
I am principled against this kind of traffic in the human species, and to disperse the families I have an aversion.
George Washington explored various means of freeing his slaves. However, he also recognized the impact manumission would have on the enslaved community when the Washington slaves were freed and the Custis dower slaves remained enslaved. Over the years, intermarriage between the groups had helped shape the Mount Vernon community. Many Washington slaves were married to dower slaves, and their freedom would inevitably separate families. Washington made the provision in his will, which he wrote the summer before his death, to immediately free his former manservant Billy Lee and the remainder of his slaves upon the death of his wife. Mrs. Washington did not wait until her death in 1802. Instead, she freed all of Washington's slaves on January 1, 1801. It was a day of celebration and sadness, as many families were impacted by separation. Upon Mrs. Washington's death in 1802, the dower slaves were divided among her 4 grandchildren, the Custis heirs. Records indicate that a number of Washington slaves were able to earn the money necessary to purchase family members from the Custis estate.